The first line should pop: the Satanic Bible did not conjure a worldwide conspiracy, start a wave of ritual crimes, or summon demons into daily life. What it did do, and why we should actually care, is more mundane and revealing. It crystallized a theatrical, provocative set of ideas into a short book that became a focal point for moral panic, legal wrangling, and cultural spectacle. Anton LaVey published the Satanic Bible in 1969. He was a showman who blended theater skepticism and a sharp critique of conventional religiosity. The book functions less like sacred scripture in the classical sense and more like a polemical manifesto aphorisms, rituals presented as psychodrama, and a set of ethical maxims that celebrate personal autonomy and skeptical inquiry. LaVey repurposed literary images of Satan, the rebel, the emancipated rationalist, as a symbol for human self, determination, and theatrical inversion of received norms. To understand the modern controversy, you need three lenses: history, text, and society. Historically, LaVey's emergence fits a larger countercultural moment. The late 1960s and early 1970s were a time when Western societies questioned institutional authority across the board. Religion, family structures, and civic norms were all up for critique. LaVey's performance, oriented rituals and blasé attitude toward superstition channeled that cultural energy into a coherent, theatrical identity. His Church of Satan cultivated an aesthetic of provocation: black robes, ceremony, cynical aphorisms, all designed to push buttons and force conversation about conformity, guilt, and desire. Textually, the Satanic Bible is hybrid and deliberately theatrical. It contains ritual scripts, aphorisms, and a version of ethics that prizes self-interest, personal responsibility, and the cultivation of power in the here and now. Rituals functioned as catharsis, symbolic acts that could help an individual release anger or mark psychological transitions. Critics who read the book as a literal invitation to criminal violence misread ritual as literal incitement rather than as psychodramatic gesture. They also overlooked LaVey's own rhetorical flair and the way he borrowed from literary and occult sources to craft a performance ethos. Societally, the book's symbolic influence far exceeded the number of formal adherents. Media attention, folklore, and panic narratives amplified anecdotes into systemic fears. The most notorious outcome was the satanic panic of the 1980s and early 1990s. Fueled by sensational journalism, dubious recovered memory therapies, and alarmist talk shows, communities across the United States and beyond imagined clandestine rings of Satanists abusing children and committing ritual crimes. Extensive investigations later found these claims to be largely unfounded. Numerous prosecutions collapsed or were overturned when evidence was scrutinized. The panic offers a useful case study in how fear can create social epidemics of belief that are disproportionate to the underlying facts. One crucial corrective is to distinguish organized theological movements from criminal actors. The Church of Satan under LaVey codified a philosophy that emphasized consensual symbolic ritual and personal autonomy. It did not advocate harming others. Other groups and individuals who used satanic labels, however, sometimes committed crimes, but their actions were not doctrinally endorsed by LaVey's movement. Collapsing these different phenomena: polemical literature, theatrical ritual, divergent subcultures, and criminal activity into a single monolithic threat obscures both truth and responsibility. Modern developments complicate the picture further. The Satanic Temple, founded in the early 2010s, is intentionally non-theistic and politically active. It uses satanic imagery as a rhetorical and legal device to challenge perceived religious privilege, campaigning for secularism, reproductive rights, and pluralism. The temple's activism has included lawsuits over religious displays, public actions to assert equal treatment for minority beliefs, and media-savvy stunts intended to test the boundaries of church-state separation. Its strategy is explicit. Use provocative symbolism to secure equal application of religious freedom norms rather than to build secret networks or engage in occult practice. Legal frameworks are central to this story. In liberal democracies, books are not banned simply for being offensive. Free speech protections limit the state's ability to suppress provocative texts unless they directly incite imminent criminal action. Courts distinguish between symbolic speech and direct incitement. Possession of controversial literature, standing alone, carries little evidentiary weight for criminal prosecution. That legal reality explains why the Satanic Bible continued to circulate, why prosecutions that relied on books as evidence often failed, and why public policy responses in most pluralist societies emphasized investigation and due process rather than wholesale censorship. Media representation matters too. Dramatic headlines, lurid talk, show interviews, and fictionalized portrayals in film.
Religious freedom for all! Our rights come from within!
And television blurred lines between fringe subcultures and criminal networks. Journalists and producers often prioritized sensational narrative arcs over careful evidence. The responsible reporter's task is to parse claims, interview credible experts, and contextualize sensational testimony with research on how rumors and moral panics escalate. When coverage instead amplifies anecdote without scrutiny, it fuels the very anxieties that lead to miscarriages of justice. Scholarly research offers necessary nuance. Sociologists and legal historians have analyzed the satanic panic as a case study in moral panic dynamics. Moral entrepreneurs identify a threat, media amplifies it, institutions respond, and social costs mount. Ethnographers have documented the internal culture of modern satanic groups, showing a range from playful symbolism to sincere philosophical communities. Historians place LaVey within a lineage of modern occult revivalism and anti-establishment performance, and theologians examine how satanic symbolism functions as social critique or as identity work. Ethically, it's important to resist dehumanization. People associated with satanic movements are not a monolith. Many are parents, professionals, and artists who use provocative symbolism to express dissent or to perform identity. When allegations of criminality arise, due process and evidentiary standards protect both victims and the accused. The lessons of the 1980s wrongful convictions, flawed interviews, and suggestive interrogations are sobering reminders of how fear can outrun fact, and of the human cost when institutions act on rumor rather than reliable evidence. There are broader cultural implications. The Satanic Bible's afterlife shows how symbols get repurposed across contexts, as a badge of rebellion in youth culture, as a rhetorical weapon in legal disputes over church-state separation, or as a device in performance art. The symbol's versatility means that the book's cultural footprint is often visible where organizational membership is not. That's why fashion, music, and visual art borrow satanic imagery even from people who have never read LaVey. The iconography performs cultural work, enabling critique and identity formation. For those seeking a deeper understanding, several practical steps help. Read primary texts in tandem with critical scholarship. Consult court records and sociological studies about the Satanic Panic. Differentiate between LaVeyan doctrine, the Satanic Temple's activism, and unrelated criminal behavior, and be skeptical of sensational claims that lack corroboration. Educators and journalists should foreground methodology. How do we know what we claim? What is the chain of evidence? What social forces might inflate a rumor into a crisis? Contemporary digital life adds a new chapter. Online forums, conspiracy-minded channels, and social media memes accelerate rumor formation and globalize local panics. False allegations and urban legends can spread quickly, and archives of sensational coverage persist indefinitely, shaping public memory. Digital literacy, understanding how to evaluate sources, corroborate claims, and spot rhetorical manipulation, is a necessary defense against repeating past errors. In legal contexts, too, the availability of unvetted online content complicates both investigation and public perception. Finally, the story raises questions about religious pluralism and tolerance. A mature liberal society must balance protection of vulnerable persons with safeguards for freedom of conscience and expression. That balance is difficult when symbols provoke visceral reactions. A better public conversation requires clarity, fierce condemnation of actual abuse, careful assessment of evidence, protection of due process, and an intellectual willingness to study controversial subcultures without reflexive condemnation. Takeaway: read the book if you must, but read widely. The Satanic Bible's history is less about secret conspiracies and more about how modern societies handle dissenting symbols, moral panic, and the messy collisions among spectacle, law, and fear. Understanding that history helps us respond to future scares with better evidence, clearer reporting, and steadier commitments to justice. The story doesn't end with a few overturned convictions and quieter headlines. It continues in quieter institutional changes and in the way societies think about rumor, risk, and the evidentiary burdens of accusation. After the worst of the panic subsided, investigators, prosecutors, and clinicians took stock. Interview techniques that had produced false memories were criticized and, in many places, restricted. Courts insisted more rigorously on corroboration rather than trusting suggestive testimony alone. Those procedural shifts matter. They make it harder for mass hysteria to crystallize into criminal convictions in the future. That legal legacy improved standards, better forensic practices, more skeptical evidentiary norms is one real consequence of the moral panic, a painful lesson converted into institutional learning. The panic demonstrated how certain kinds of evidence, extraordinary anecdote, authoritative sounding but unverified testimony, and dramatized media reporting can conspire to produce a social reality that feels true, even if it's false. Once people accept a sensational narrative, confirmation bias keeps it alive. Ambiguous facts are interpreted to confirm the story, dissenting voices are dismissed as naive or corrupt, and institutions feel pressured to act decisively lest they appear soft. Recognizing these cognitive dynamics helps civic actors resist the adrenaline of panic and prefer measured inquiry. That's not to say there aren't real harms connected to contemporary occult or fringe subcultures. Individuals sometimes act violently or abusively while cloaking motivation in subcultural language. But responsible analysis distinguishes between subcultural rhetoric and causation. If a perpetrator claims satanic inspiration, the crime should be investigated on its own evidence, not treated as proof of a conspiratorial movement. Treating a violent act as exemplary of an entire symbol-using community is both unjust and analytically lazy. One of the more interesting contemporary developments is how some groups have reclaimed the language and iconography of Satan to perform legal and political functions. The Satanic Temple, for instance, intentionally levers the shock value of satanic symbolism to test and secure religious liberties. By framing themselves as a religion for legal purposes, complete with congregations, rituals, and a doctrine of secular activism, they force courts and public institutions to confront the reality that religious freedom is not only for popular or traditional faiths. Whether you agree with their tactics or find them theatrical, the temple's strategy has produced measurable legal effects. It has advanced litigation around equal access to public spaces and challenged governmental favoritism toward major faiths. There are also aesthetic strands to consider. The Satanic Bible's rhetoric and iconography migrated into popular culture. Heavy metal and shock rock musicians adopted the imagery to signal transgression. Filmmakers and authors mined the motifs for horror and satire.
We commend this knowledge to the people.
And with the blessing of the gods, we secure the future of our great city.
Fashion designers used inverted crosses and occult motifs as subcultural signifiers. For many users, the symbolism performs identity work, a way to telegraph rebelliousness, irony, or outsider status more than a literal metaphysical commitment. That aesthetic channel explains why the imagery persists so widely.
We clasp hands this day, uniting our people under the sight of the gods.
May this peace last for 1,000 years.
Symbols that once marked a controversial religious manifesto now circulate as cultural shorthand for edgy critique. Academically, the phenomenon of Satanism invites interdisciplinary study. Historians trace the genealogy of satanic imagery and its appropriation. Sociologists study the mechanics of moral panics and stigma. Legal scholars examine the tensions between free expression and public safety. Psychologists analyze memory, suggestion, and mass belief. The array of scholarly responses models precisely the balanced approach this topic needs: context, evidence, and humility. Scholars emphasize method over outrage, a posture that public journalists would do well to emulate. For media makers, the cautionary tale is vivid. Sensationalism may yield clicks in the short term, but it corrodes credibility and can have dire real-world costs. Responsible storytelling about controversial subcultures requires triangulation, corroborating testimony, vetting expert sources, and distinguishing between symbolic rhetoric and documented organizational behavior. When journalists get that right, public understanding deepens rather than panics. When they get it wrong, fearscapes spread. What about the book itself, approached as literature? The Satanic Bible is an artifact of its time, a late 20th century pamphlet of cultural rebellion. It's rhetorically sharp, occasionally aphoristic, and theatrically performative. If you read it to understand LaVey's persona and the cultural moment he exploited, it's useful material. If you read it as a manual for criminal behavior, you will misunderstand its function and its rhetorical genre. Context matters. LaVey wrote for effect, not necessarily as a blueprint for organized criminality. So, what should a careful reader or curious citizen do if they want to understand this terrain and avoid repeating past mistakes? Start with primary and secondary sources. Read LaVey's book with a critical eye and in conversation with scholarly analysis that situates it historically and sociologically. Consult court records and investigative reports from the era of the panic to see how evidence held up under scrutiny. Read sociological accounts of moral panic dynamics. Stanley Cohen's work is a classic starting point, and legal scholarship on free expression and group protection. Look at ethnographic studies of contemporary Satanist groups, including the Satanic Temple, to see how identity, ritual, and political strategy operate in practice. Also practice source hygiene in your everyday media consumption. Ask, who is making this claim? What is the evidence? Are there corroborating sources? Could vivid storytelling or a political agenda be shaping the narrative? These habits reduce the chance of being swept up in the next wave of unverified hysteria. In the age of social media, those habits are not merely academic niceties, they're civic skills. There's another public policy lesson here, one that touches on education and prevention. Panics thrive where fear fills an informational void. That's why public education, not censorship, is the best inoculation. Schools, community groups, and journalists can help by teaching critical thinking, media literacy, and the basics of legal process. Civic institutions that explain how investigations work, what rights accused persons have, and how to evaluate claims help inoculate communities against rumor-driven crises. Finally, confronting the history of the Satanic Bible and ensuing controversies invites a broader reflection on pluralism. Democratic societies function best when they protect both the vulnerable and the dissident. That means providing robust support for abuse victims and equally robust protections for due process and free expression. It also means recognizing that symbols are polyvalent. They carry multiple meanings depending on the user, the audience, and the context. A mature civic culture resists equating symbolic offense with criminality, while remaining vigilant about genuine abuse. The Satanic Bible's trajectory from 1960s icon of theatrical rebellion to lightning rod for moral panic to an unlikely instrument in modern legal activism is a reminder that cultural artifacts rarely have simple lives. They are refracted through media, law, art, and social fear. Understanding that history helps us respond with evidence and nuance rather than with spectacle. It allows us to protect the vulnerable while defending civil liberties, to critique dangerous ideas without criminalizing marginal identities, and to study controversial subcultures with the same rigor we apply to any complex social phenomenon. Above all, it's a reminder that moral panics tell us as much about the societies that produce them as about the alleged threats themselves. Studying those panics honestly, critically, and without sensationalism makes us wiser and, hopefully, more just.